It's an honor, actually, to have this opportunity to talk to you. I'm reminded of a line from Martin Luther King Jr., who said that our lives begin to end on the day we stop talking about things that matter most. And America, collectively, has not been talking about things that matter most. But it's interesting because in our personal lives, I think we do. I think that if any two of us went out for lunch after the talk today, you wouldn't necessarily know one another, but within 30 minutes you'd know who was in therapy, who had been through what trauma. What's going on, babe?
I'm just turning you up.
It's enough, I think.
Is it enough?
It's enough. You can hear me, right?
Yeah. Okay.
You would know who had been through what trauma, who might have a toxic relationship, who might need to set a boundary, and how you were practicing self-care. That's, we'd be up in each other's face all about it, because we certainly spend enough time talking about what's really going on in our personal lives. When it comes to our collective experience, however, we have been trained. When we get together to talk collectively about political matters, we've all been trained to think like sixth graders. We go kind of dumb and numb, and we assume that somebody else is handling those things. Well, I think we can all agree they've sure handled it. They've handled it to the point where we're 6 inches from the cliff. We're 6 inches from the cliff in terms of the state of our democracy. We're 6 inches from the cliff in terms of the state of our environment. And many people in our own personal lives are 6 inches from the cliff in terms of the state of their housing, in terms of the state of their own personal economies, in terms of college loan debt, in terms of medical bills, and so forth. So I think it's time for us to do in our collective conversation what we do in our personal conversations. Grow up, wake up, get real, and get busy. And if we saw any of us acting in our personal lives with as much distractedness in the face of what is genuine disaster potentially lying there in front of us, if any of us knew any of us individually doing that, we'd say, what are you doing? Give me your phone. Give me your phone. You've got to stop this. And particularly if you had a romantic partner and the romantic partner kept cheating on you and cheating on you and cheating on you, but every equivalent of 4 years came back and said, oh, honey, give me one more chance. I'll do it next term. Again, you would say, no, do not call him back. We've got to rise up collectively in the same way that we routinely rise up in our personal lives. I always say when I travel internationally, I'm always happy to sit next to an American because I like how right in your face we are. But we have forgotten that when it comes to our collective experience, it's the same kinds of dynamics, by the way. You know, all that a country is a group of people. So the same principles that prevail within the life of an individual prevail within the life of a nation. And to me, politics is the art of creating a more beautiful world. That's what it should be. If the purpose of our lives is to create the good, the true, and the beautiful, then the purpose of our collective experience should be to create the good, the true, and the beautiful. And that's why Mahatma Gandhi said that politics should be sacred. When he said politics should be sacred, he didn't mean it should be religious. He wasn't talking about religious dogma or doctrine. He was talking about the place inside us that we come from when we're engaged in a conversation. Are we talking just silliness and superficiality, or are we getting deep and we're getting real? And I know that we have the capacity to get deep and real politically because we get deep and real in our personal lives. But we have to expand beyond the confines that have been imposed upon us. We've been in a kind of trance, and we've been trained to expect too little. We've been trained, I'm sorry to say, to trust people that did not earn our trust. We've been trained to keep giving people a chance over and over and over again, when if we take any kind of an adult look at this, they're not changing. It's not going to change. And if we keep electing them and we keep putting them there and we keep saying, oh, okay, then we have no reason to expect any different. Even to the point where we have a fascist at the door. And you know, people have said to me from the beginning of my running for president, Marianne, don't you realize, how could you be doing this? Don't you realize there's a fascist at the door? My response to this, I'm doing this because there is a fascist at the door. And I want to tell you something else. A fascist should never have gotten so close to the door. And we have to take ownership of the fact that our society was so vulnerable to such as one as he. Now, I agree with Franklin Roosevelt, who said that we would not have to worry about a fascist takeover in this country as long as democracy delivers on its promises. You know why a fascist is at the door? Because democracy has not delivered on its promises. You know why? Because if it was, we would have in this society what they have in every other advanced democracy: universal health care, which they have in every other advanced democracy and other advanced countries that aren't even democracies. And by the way, I think it's interesting to note that a majority of Republicans as well as Democrats, not as big a majority, but a majority, want universal health care. And we could have an improved Medicare for all. That could include eyeglasses, hearing aids, dental, and mental health care. Gee, why don't? Is it really what they say, that it's just so complicated? No, everyone, it is not complicated. It is corrupt. The only reason we don't have those things is because of the institutionalized greed of the insurance companies. And even if we don't know that, they do. They do. But they know that the insurance companies, because of the money, the influence that they are able to exert in Washington because of their donations, has created a situation where it has to do with our health, it has to do with our education, it has to do with our environment, it has to do with our military, it has to do with guns on the street, it has to do with carcinogens in our food, quality in our food, quality in our air, quality in our water, chemicals in our pesticides, for no other reason than that short-term profits for these huge corporate entities and the economic behemoth that they have become, the matrix of economic tyranny that they now are in every sector of American society. Their profits are placed before your and my safety, health, and well-being. And guess what? That's not going to change unless we change it, because that's the new status quo. That status quo will not disrupt itself. Now, I'd like to point out what we all know. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. See, this is not a moment when it's about, we just really need more data. We really need to collect more data. We need more analysis. I'll give you some analysis. 1 in 4 Americans live with medical debt. 68,000 Americans die every year from lack of health care. 18 million Americans cannot afford to pay for the prescriptions that their doctors give them. 75 to 90 million people are uninsured or underinsured. In no other advanced democracy or any other advanced country are people having to put GoFundMe pages on the internet to pay for life-saving operations for themselves or for their children. It doesn't happen in other countries. Let me tell you what else doesn't happen. 1.3 million people rationing their insulin. We're like, oh, okay, really? Oh, okay. And then when they say, we gave you some. Oh, thank you, Mrs. Thank you. Are you kidding me? So let's take on some more data. Those of you who are young, I want you to know what those of us who are older remember. Before the 1970s, we had tuition-free college and tech school in this country. There was a system in Texas, Florida, California. In other words, and that's something else I want you youngins to know. And when I say this, those of you who are older are going to remember this. Those of you who are younger, you might know intellectually that what I'm about to say is true, but you still might think it sounds like some kind of a fairy tale. So I want you to know it's not a fairy tale. You ready for this? It was a long ago, faraway land called the 1970s. Let me describe it to you. The average couple could afford a house. The average couple could afford a car. The average couple could afford a yearly vacation. One salary could support a family of 4. They could afford for one parent to stay home with the kids if they wanted to, and they could afford to send their kids, plural, to college. You know what the word is that describes such a situation? The phrase is thriving middle class. We don't have one anymore. There has been a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 1% of Americans over the last 50 years. completely collapsing our middle class. Someone was saying today that $150,000 a year is now considered lower middle class. Now, this did not happen accidentally. It was strategized. And those of us who are old enough to remember were there when it happened. Now, some people say it actually started with the austerity of Jimmy Carter, but it certainly started policy-wise, full-blown, under the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And it was sold to us as this great economic idea that was just going to make the country so much better. It was called Reaganomics. It's called trickle-down economics. And it was the idea that the corporation should serve more than anything else the responsibility to increase stockholder value. And then the idea was, if stockholders made more money, and also the CEOs, because before the 1980s, a CEO could not be paid in stock options. And you couldn't advertise pharmaceutical drugs on television. There were all kinds of ways in which capitalism was not completely yet unfettered to become its most malevolent, soulless strain. But what we were told was that this was going to be really good, see, because a few people were going to get really, really rich, and that was going to be great for us because they were going to become job creators. It's going to be so good, see? And so then they would create so many jobs, and all that money would trickle down. And then because all that money trickled down, it was going to lift all boats. Okay? So how many more decades before we, have the jury come in here? Because what it has done, has thrown millions of people off the boats they were already on. It has left millions of people in the ocean without even a life vest. Why is that? Because their business model was never job creation. Their business model was job elimination. Their business model is worker exploitation. Their worker model is suppression of unions. Their business model is slashing taxes for the very, very richest. So stockholders took precedence over every other stakeholder. Stakeholders like the workers, the community, the environment. Even today, with 39%, and this is one of those statistics that I hope you will listen to this with your heart as well as your head. 39% of Americans now report that they regularly skip meals in order to pay their rent. Half of the renters in the United States cannot afford their rent. And then the newest thing, of course, is all these people, millions of them, selling their blood plasma in order to make it. But to hear the punditry class, which works as shills and megaphones for the political media industrial complex, the economy's great. The economy's really good. The economy's great.
Feels great.
For whom? For whom? I'll tell you who it's great for. It's great for 20% of us. Now, I'm not minimizing that, actually, because for that 20%, it's good, and that's to be celebrated. That's not enough. The problem isn't that some people can get rich in America. That's good. What's bad is that not nearly enough people ever get a chance to. And many of those people are locked out by 10 years old. There are millions of American children who go to schools where they don't even have the resources to teach a child to read by the age of 10. And if a child does not know how to read by the age of 10, the chances of high school graduation are drastically reduced, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. We have a problem. Things are not going well, and we need to solve that problem. We need an economic Bill of Rights. We need Medicare for all, improved Medicare for all, like they have in every other advanced democracy. We need tuition-free college and tech school, like they have in every other advanced democracy. We need complete elimination of the college loan debt through the Higher Education Act, because it's immoral that those loans ever existed at all. We need subsidized child care. We need guaranteed sick pay. We need guaranteed jobs. And we need a guaranteed living wage. Now, everything I just described is considered a moderate position. in every other advanced democracy. But they would have you think that what I just said was, whoa, way out there, left wing, way out there, fringe. You can't possibly listen to that. She's not a serious candidate. Why do they say that? Because this is deadly serious, and they know that. So they would have you think, oh, this isn't serious. If your life is serious, then the fact that those carcinogens are in your food, which are not allowed in other advanced democracies, I would think that's a pretty serious topic. Whether or not a child who's living in a poor neighborhood is breathing air that is so toxic that they have asthma, which means that they can't even run, a little child not even being able to run for 30 seconds without running out of breath, and parents not even being able to afford the inhaler, I would say that's pretty serious. But they don't want to, they're the ones who are unserious, and they don't want to talk about what's seriously going on in this country. People's lives are falling apart. That's what's going on in this country. 70% of Americans now report that they live with chronic economic anxiety. A majority of Americans living paycheck to paycheck. A majority of Americans unable to absorb a $1,000 unexpected expenditure. When we talked before about the 75 to 90 million who are uninsured or underinsured, this business of underinsurance is very interesting. Doctors have told me, one doctor said to me, I don't even know why I bother to practice medicine anymore. And another doctor said to me, I have people come into my office who used to say, if I told them a particular treatment was needed, the most common question I heard was, what are the side effects? Today, she said, the most common question is, what will it cost? Why is that? Because of how many millions of Americans have insurance that covers the office visit, but doesn't cover the test that the doctor wants to run, or doesn't cover the treatment, doesn't cover the operation. And for 18 million Americans, doesn't cover the prescriptions. Now, as I said before, this situation is not going to repair itself. This situation is now baked into the cake. This is the new status quo in the United States. And inertia means the tendency of the object to move in whatever direction it's been moving. So this is the issue. We have a matrix of corporate powers, and this matrix of corporate powers represents this reversion on our part to what is essentially an aristocratic system. We call it a corporatocracy, but I like using the word aristocracy because what it is we've psychologically reverted. And we lived so many centuries, our ancestors lived so many centuries just thinking that was just the way it was, and that a few people were entitled to the land and the old landed gentry. A few people were entitled to the wealth creation, and everyone else was just basically serfs. An economic system should be serving the people. What's happening in America today is that people are serving the economic system. And so we have this matrix: insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, big food companies, big agricultural companies, big chemical companies, gun manufacturers, oil companies, defense contractors. And they're this matrix of corporate powers. And as long as we're living at a time where their short-term profits are routinely placed before your safety, health, and well-being, because your elected representatives, which theoretically are there to serve your best interests and your expressed will, instead do more to serve their economic interests, because those people as donors actually have more power to put them back in office or to get them out of office than they think you do, because we're so distracted and disgusted with the whole thing. We're not always voting. That's the pickle we're in now, especially with Citizens United 14 years ago giving unlimited permission to these dark money forces of corporate power and the billionaire donor class that goes with them. Now, we've got to dismantle this. We've got to interrupt this. We need to intervene here. And in order to know how to do that, I think it gives us great power to inform ourselves, to remind ourselves, not only how it happened in terms of what I was talking about during President Reagan, but how did all this really begin? And if you want to know how it all really began, let's go back to 1776. Okay? Now, 1776, some very brave men signed the Declaration of Independence. I'm mentioning that they were brave because if the British had won the war, they would have all been executed as traitors against the King of England. Now, in their signing that document, they changed the world because they posited and infused into the founding of a nation principles which changed everything. Principles which opened up a space of possibility for the human race that literally had never existed before. These principles are not only politically important, they're morally and spiritually important because they speak to the human condition. They speak to what a human being is and what a human being's rights should be just by virtue of the fact that we live on this earth. Now, in the Jewish religion, it is said that every generation must rediscover God for itself. I think every generation of Americans must rediscover the radicalism of the Declaration of Independence for ourselves. What has happened is those principles are inscribed on marble walls, they're placed in, written on parchment, under glass in Washington, D.C., and when our kids are in the 8th grade, they go and they take a trip and they see it. If that's all it is, if it's no longer inscribed on our hearts, if we're no longer seeing the relevance of this stuff to us in our time, then those principles lose their moral force. And losing their moral force, we become easy to play. And that's what's happened. We've been played. So we need to rediscover the meaning of those principles. And when we do, we see not only were they radical in 1776, they're very radical today. And Abraham Lincoln, referring to the Declaration of Independence, which he said was the moral basis of the Civil War, he said that it is our eternal rebuke to all systems of tyranny and oppression. Number one, all men are created equal. Number two, all are created with inalienable rights of life, of liberty, and of the pursuit of happiness, which I think in our time would be translated as self-actualization. Do what you want to do. Be who you want to be. Go for it. Fly high. Do with your life whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anyone else. You have that right. And then it gets even more radical. It says that governments are instituted to secure those rights. Not chip away at those rights, not diminish those rights, not undercut those rights, to actually secure those rights. And then it gets even more radical than that. If government is not doing that job, it is the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it. It is the most traditionally American thing to say hell no in the face of tyranny or oppression. Now that's where it all started, but it's also where, as we know, it all got gnarly. Because out of the 56 signers of the Declaration, 41 of them were slave owners. Now, you can't have a greater transgression against the principles of the Declaration of Independence than slavery. So isn't that interesting? What was there at the very beginning embodies America's DNA. That is the American mind. That is the American story. We have always been both and. That's who we are. In every generation, we've been both and in our generation, we're both and. We are both a people filled with some who get, well, this is big. This is like huge. This is like profound. And this not only gives me profound rights, but also profound responsibilities to protect this thing and to expand it and to protect it from all assault from within or without. But then, from the beginning, and in every generation, even now, there have been those who are people who for their own ideological and or financial purposes, have no intention whatsoever of seeing those principles made manifest, and have made it clear with their behavior that they will do whatever it takes, to the most atrocious and heinous extremes, to make sure that they are not. That's the American story. Nothing we're going through now is new. And when you realize that, you go, whoa, this is the same archetypal thing that's been happening from the beginning. So then you look and you go, well, how did other generations handle it? And you realize that other generations were very impressive, thank you. Now, every generation is a reiteration of the basic struggle, but some more dramatic than others. So other generations rose up. They repudiated slavery, the Civil War, abolition, constitutional amendment. There was the institutional suppression of women. Other generations rose up. The women's suffragist movement, the passage of the 19th Amendment. The first Gilded Age. Other generations rose up, repudiated it with the establishment of organized labor. And then there was the institutionalized suppression of black people in the American South in the form of segregation. Other generations rose up, repudiated it with the Civil Rights Movement, with the Voting Rights Act, and the Civil Rights Act. I've spent the last year of my life running for president because it's our turn now. It's our turn now. Today, it's not a specific institution. It's an economic paradigm. And this economic paradigm now has infected every corner of American society. Every single corner of American society. And the worst news of all, it has infected Washington, D.C. to the point where not only does Washington, D.C. routinely push back, Washington, D.C. routinely enables the tyrants. Now, not every rich person is a greedy bastard. This is not personal. There are some very, very wealthy people who would be probably agreeing with everything we're talking about here today. It's about systems. And as I said before, it is the most traditional thing in the world for Americans to rise up at any time and say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. That's what the abolitionists said, we're not going to do that anymore. That's what the women's suffragists said, we're not going to do that anymore. That's what the early labor organizers said, we're not going to do that anymore. And that's what the civil rights movement, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Because they, for whatever reason, remembered that the country is supposed to belong to us. Abraham Lincoln stood on the battlefield at Gettysburg. Now, with that battle, and I like to mention this piece of trivia because I actually didn't realize it until last year when I was reading a book. I didn't know, actually, some of you might be thinking, well, that's dumb, but I had not realized that the Battle of Gettysburg was the decisive battle in the Civil War, after which it was then understood the North was going to win. He stood on the battlefield, and in the Gettysburg Address, he said that the men who died there for the Union had given what he called the last full measure of devotion, so that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. I submit to you, it's perishing now. We are not currently, for all intents and purposes, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That is perishing on our watch. We are a government of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. When you have that situation, when you have the collapse of the middle class, to which I have already referred, you are no longer functioning as a democracy. You are functioning as an oligarchy. You know, I've had a 40-year career working up close and personal with people. My field has been one of personal transformation. And the same principles that apply in transforming one life apply to transforming a nation. You're going to have to get real now. And you're going to have to look in the mirror. And you're going to have to ask yourself, where do I and where do I not stand on the principles on which I purport to stand? Where do I have my own stuff to clean up? Where do I have to clean up the past so that I can have the conservatives feel this way as much as high-minded left? You know, this ruse has been created, that the problem is the people on the left, the problem is the people on the right. All that's been artificially created so that you don't look up, as they say in the movie. The real dichotomy is not left versus right, it's powerful versus powerless. It's those who have capital and access to ever more amounts of capital versus those who are struggling to get by. Now, the system that perpetuates all this would have you think that in order to lead the nation, someone must be one of them. It's what they call qualified, but their idea of qualified is qualified to perpetuate the system as it is. And I'd like to go over with you for a moment what the Constitution says makes you qualified. You know, I've had so many of those people look at me like, who let you in here? And I want to say, James Madison let me in. A little help from Susan B. Anthony. Who are these people? Like, well, this is not what the Constitution does not name these people. The Constitution says nothing about a political class. This country was founded to reject that kind of aristocratic attitude. And so in the Constitution, it says that in order to be president, you have to have lived here for 14 years. You have to be 35 years old or older, and you have to have been born here. And it doesn't say you had to have been a congressman. You had to have been a senator. You had to have been a governor, which is also an interesting question because I've never heard they bring out that one about a man. Whether it was Vivek Ramaswamy, Bobby Kennedy, Andrew Yang. How can you do this? You've never served in office. No, that's one of many things they only bring out if they're talking about a woman in politics. I never in my career, I've had a long career, I never felt that my sex was a limit. I never felt being a woman in any way limited my opportunities or people's perception. But in politics, I can't even believe it. I didn't really know what the word misogyny meant until I've had this visceral experience of how they will even talk about a woman, frame something that happens in her life or her campaign in such a different way. I mean, this thing is locked up. But I remind you, so was slavery. And so was the institutional suppression of women, and so was the Gilded Age, and so was segregation. Other generations unlocked it. Let's not be the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes in our time to rebuke forces of tyranny and oppression. And this is economic tyranny. This is economic tyranny. When in the richest country in the world, 68,000 people a year are dying from lack of health care in the richest country in the world. Something is fundamentally off. And see, that's what the system which serves that corporate behemoth. You see, before I ran for president, I knew there was a problem with the political parties. And I knew that the political parties were chopping wood and carrying water for those corporate powers. What I realize now, they are corporate powers. They're not just shilling for corporate powers. They are corporate powers, and they feel they have the right to curate not only who you vote for, but who you even get exposed to. So, for instance, if you're not one of them, all of a sudden you're not even on CNN. You're not even on MSNBC. You're not even on the Sunday morning talk shows and news programs. You're kicked off ballots. You're lied about, you're smeared, your campaign is infiltrated. This is serious. I'm fine, I'm a big girl, I have a life, but you need to know, because candidate suppression is a form of voter suppression. It's not okay if one party suppresses votes, but the other party suppresses candidates. It all amounts to the same. We should have, we're the people, we should have exposure to all candidates, what they have to say, and the agenda that they have to submit to you. And the fact that they have not wanted you to hear mine is because of everything I've said here today, which, by the way, I want to repeat, is considered moderate in every other advanced democracy. But it does challenge the right of huge corporate forces to have their economics be our bottom line. You can either have short-term profit maximization for huge corporations be your governing principle, or you can have democracy. You can't have both. Money has to circulate. Money has to circulate. Wealth creating opportunities, economic opportunity has to circulate in a society the way blood circulates in a body. I remember reading a book called Gardens of Democracy, and it was referring to this, saying, what if all the blood in your body was in one arm? And so what we have now is a situation in which a few are getting ever richer, and the vast majority of people are struggling to make it at all. People who've been in school, people who've done everything right. Even our young people in these college loan debts. For those of you who are older like myself, I'd like to ask you to please just think for a moment about who you were in your 20s. Who you were in your 20s, could you have handled tens of thousands of dollars worth of college loan debt? I mean, could your nervous system have taken it? Would you be who you are today? And then they can't imagine where this mental health crisis came from. Well, if you have 70% of Americans who live with chronic economic anxiety, and you're carrying so much debt, debt is crippling at any age. But of course a kid's depressed. Of course a kid is anxious. Any of us would be carrying all that debt. And what did these kids do? What did they do? They were trying to better their lives. That's what they were trying to do, and particularly young people of color. There's a racial element there that is particularly unjust, because young people of color were told, if you get your education, you'll close the wage gap. But what is happening in so many young people that I've talked to, they get out of school, they've got this huge college loan debt, like I was saying, like tens of thousands of dollars, right? Some of them more than that. They've got these huge debts, and they start to do the math. Well, paying at this rate, I will be out of debt by the time I'm 60. Now, for those of us who are over 60, that took about a minute. But to them, that seems forever from now, right? So a lot of these kids say, well, to hell with it. I'm going to just go work in a job that will allow me to maybe get out from under this by the time I'm 40 or 45. And then they say, why did I even bother to get the degree? Alert. We should be setting our young people up to win, not cutting them off at their knees. This is insane. A sane society. People say this country should be run like a business. No, this country should be run like a financially responsible family. It's not about profit first. It's about your children first. It's about your home, which is the earth first. And it can't even just be your children. It has to be also the children on the other side of town. It has to be children on the other side of the world. So these are fundamental reforms that we need. We need an economic Bill of Rights with Medicare for all, tuition-free college and tech school, and all of the things that I mentioned. And we need more than that. We need a Department of Peace. We need to learn to wage peace. Just like you can't only treat sickness, you have to proactively try to cultivate health. We can't just, every time there's an expression of violence, drop more bombs or build more prisons. We have to create justice and brotherhood in order to prevent the violence to begin with. And that's why we should have a Department of Peace. We should have a Ministry of Peace. We should have a place where peace builders are trained. Just like we have a military academy, we should have a peace academy. Just like we play war games, we should play peace games. We should imagine a world without war in 100 years and reverse engineer from there. Now, some people would say, oh, she's so naive. She's a little woo-woo, you know, a little wacky. How naive. I'll tell you what's naive. What's naive is to think that we can reasonably assume that this planet will be habitable for the human race in another 100 years if we don't at least try. Now, peace building is a real thing. Peace building is an actual set of experiences, expertise, and skills. And those skills have to do with 4 factors which statistically indicate, and this could be a corner of an American city or it could be another corner of the world. When these factors are present, statistically you have a higher incidence of peace and a lower incidence of violence. They're not going to surprise anybody. Number 1, greater economic opportunities for women. Number 2, greater educational opportunities for children. Number 3, a reduction of violence against women, and number 4, an amelioration of unnecessary human despair. Large groups of desperate people should be considered a national security risk. Large groups of desperate people look throughout history, become a petri dish out of which all manner of personal and societal dysfunction becomes almost inevitable, including ideological capture, vulnerability to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. This is why we treated Germany and Japan so differently after World War II, with the Marshall Plan seeking to help them rebuild, as opposed to the devastation of Germany after World War I, which then became such easy prey for Adolf Hitler. Desperate people in large groups are dangerous. So the idea of treating each other lovingly is not only the good thing to do, it is the smart thing to do. And that includes, next, our children. Now, America's children are at risk in ways that officialdom does not even acknowledge. Why? Because they're not old enough to work, so they don't have any financial leverage. They're not old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency. But let's talk about America's children for a minute. We have millions of children, are you ready for this, who were traumatized before preschool. I have spoken to elementary school principals who say they have students on suicide watch. In public schools throughout America, there are routinely trauma rooms. Can we ask ourselves, please, what is going on in this country that for so many millions of children, just childhood is routinely traumatic? Now, if we want to have the country that I know all of us would wish for in 20 years, we need to move massive resources into the direction of children under 10 today. And that means particularly early childhood. We know things now about early childhood they didn't even know 15 years ago about the human brain and so forth. 90% of the brain develops in the first 5 years. There is so much that we could do. And that's why I want to have a Department of Children and Youth. If I were president, one of my greatest joys and earliest tasks would be convening the greatest minds in the United States on the issue of early childhood. But it's not just childhood. It's also farming, it's agriculture, it's food, it's healing, it's business, it's economics. We have the problem solvers. The problem in America is not that we don't have geniuses, it's not that we don't have best practices, it's not that we don't have people who know what to do. The issue is that the people with solutions are over here, and people with the power are over here. And people with the solutions don't have the power. And the people with the power don't really want to hear from the solutions, really. Because the problem solvers represent solutions that may or may not undercut the corporate profits of their donors. So what happens is that the people with solutions, and some of you might even be in this room, you're working hard, you've got a nonprofit, you're trying to raise $25,000, $50,000, we raise $100,000. Meanwhile, the people who are creating the problem over here are giving billions of dollars in corporate subsidies to the very people who are causing the problems. We need a president who opens the door and the windows of the Oval Office and says to all the problem solvers out there, come on in, guys, we have it for 4 years. That's the problem. It's not that the people don't know what to do, and my deep, deep faith and conviction at this point is that we're ready. This country needs a regreening, but actually it's happening. You know, it's like we're living at a time of two parallel realities. One is a world that is falling apart, and another is the world that is struggling to be born. But right now, we have to recognize that the system is, as I have described it, in terms of locked up for interests that are actually counter to the idea of the universal opportunity to be given to the people of the United States. That's the sacred contract, which is supposed to be the social contract between government and its people in this country. Government is supposed to be a broker between individual liberty and the common good. Individual liberty does include financial liberty. Go out, make money, have a good time, happy for you. But you can't hurt anybody else. But these days, it's been such a drive towards the private sector at the expense of our common good. And government is driving the trend towards privatization because it is the private powers that are empowering the government. You know what that is, ladies and gentlemen, and anyone else? That right there is soft fascism. So one of the reasons why we have serious, hardcore fascism at the door is because we've had lightweight fascism for far too long. And so at this point, I feel very, very strongly that the only way, and this is for those of you who are either Democrats, independents, or Republicans who do not wish to see Donald Trump back in the White House. Because I do not in any way minimize the threat that he poses. But we can't just live from, we just got to beat him as though once we beat him, it's going to be okay. We have Trumpism on our hands, not just Trump. And so we have to go higher than just, we can't just, this season, just, okay, we're going to close our eyes and we're going to cross our fingers and we're going to just will our way and we're going to raise enough money for TV ads and we're going to really shame anybody who asks any questions. That's not the way we're going to win. We're going to win by offering people the chance at a better life. We're going to win by saying to people, government policy should support your thriving. That's the purpose of government policy. This is not about the government spending money because the government's money is your money. You pay taxes. And your taxes should pay for Medicare for all, and your taxes should pay for subsidized childhood, and your taxes should pay for tuition-free college and so forth. Your taxes should pay for a guaranteed living wage. As I said earlier, we've been trained to expect too little. Now, I've spent 1 year of my life in the belly of the beast. I ran last time. And they were satisfied to just treat me like a joke. But still, I was on CNN. I had a CNN town hall. I was on MSNBC some. This time, they saw me coming in some invisible edict. Do not let that woman have a viral moment. I was not on CNN. I was not on MSNBC. I was kicked off ballots, denied speaking gigs.
No debates either.
Campaigns infiltrated. This is serious stuff. It's not just about me. We need to know this. So, the big shocker, the president has the delegates and he is now the nominee. I respect that. I mean, I don't respect the process, actually, because I know how it went. But I respect, I'm not delusional. Because you might be asking, what are you here for? And I'll tell you why I'm here. We need to have this conversation.
Absolutely.
We need to have this conversation, and if you help me, I will get delegates. And if I get delegates, I will be at the convention. And if I'm at the convention, I will do my best to make noise. Good. If I am at the convention... And that is the point. The point is we're also constricted now, and you're not supposed to paint outside the lines. And you're not supposed to say anything that does not just toe the line with the corporatist agenda. It's either the hardcore corporatist agenda or the softcore corporatist agenda. And the softcore corporatist agenda does want to help people, but it only wants to help you to the point where if we go any further, it would undercut the corporate bottom line on our donors. But what will help you do is just survive this unjust system more easily. The issue is not just to survive an unjust system, we need to end the injustice. You know, a young woman came up to me at my talk in Scottsdale today, and she was speaking to exactly what my own process has been in my career. She said that she was a psychologist. And she said, but I keep meeting with patients whose problems are systemic. And she said, so these days everybody uses the word resilient. She said, I'm being asked to make people feel better living within a really economically unjust country. No, we need to end the injustice. You can't just make it so hard for people and then just throw them into the lap of clergy and therapists and spiritual counselors and so forth. No. And I also want to remind you that the greatest social justice movements come from in this history, in our history, come from religious and spiritual circles. Every time somebody tells me to stay in my lane, first of all, there aren't supposed to be any lanes in this country. Oh, what lanes? What lanes? You get out of this lane that you created for yourself. But I want to point out that among white Americans, the abolitionist movement emerged from the early evangelical churches in New Hampshire. And most of the women who were leaders of the women's suffragist movement were religious Quakers. And let's not forget that Dr. King was a Baptist preacher. It is faith in that which is yet unseen. It is faith in ultimate, infinite possibility despite worldly conditions that is exactly what we need now. That is why we need a spiritual awakening as well as an economic awakening. Because if all you see as real is the evidence of the material world, then we do have every reason to be depressed. But if you realize that it is our job as created beings, as the Declaration of Independence says we are, to ever make new. This country is ready for it. The people are ready for it. We are. Not only that, I think Americans, it's in our DNA. Remember, we were born of the idea of, no, we're going to do it different now. Mm-hmm. That's the whole point here. So when we're not called to do great things, we're like wilted flowers. People are like tired, not because we're doing so much, but because we're not doing enough that is grand and important. Mm-hmm. I think Americans want to be called to the next great thing. This will energize us. Now, when I was in the active phase of my campaign, before the president had the delegates that he has, I would often say, I'm not a politician standing in front of you saying, let me go to Washington and fight for you. That does not sound to me like a good time for 4 years. I don't want to go to Washington and fight for you. But I'd love to go to Washington and co-create with you a new chapter of American history. We need to cut the cord with a very dysfunctional, very aberrational chapter of our history that's been going on now for about 50 years. And that's what we do in America, and that's what we do in our personal lives. Sometimes you say, okay, I got to start over. And that means that it's not just politicians in Washington, it is citizens who reassume power. We have to, those of us who are old enough, have to take responsibility for the fact that we allowed it to get this bad. We all have to be active. We have to be active in your local communities. You have to be active in your state house. A lot of ground zeros now are on the state level. We have to begin, for the next 20 years, really, to begin to see political activism and understanding as simply a layer of a well-lived, meaningful life. And if we do that, we will be able to look at ourselves in the mirror and know that in our time, we pulled it off, just as our ancestors did. They were no different than us. They were traumatized by the whole thing. I don't want to hear anybody else say, oh, I'm so traumatized by it. You think the people who walked across the bridge at Selma were not traumatized? Does every woman here remember that the women suffragists were thrown into prison for no greater crime than marching for suffrage? And they were thrown into the prison where the conditions were so awful that they went on a hunger strike. And the response of the prison officials was to send men into their cells and force these metal contraptions onto their necks and force feed them. Don't you think they were a little anxious? Toughen up, buttercups. We have a democracy to save. And we have a lot of hours in every day. And they cried when they needed to cry. And they went through what they needed to go through. You know, I love reading historical biographies because you learn so much more from history when you're reading about the people. Like there's a wonderful book called No Ordinary Time. Never mind. By Doris Kearns Goodwin, and it is about Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt during the 1930s and 1940s. And in that book, there is so much that is relevant to what we're going through now. But another story that I absolutely love from presidential history, because it so reminds us that they were just people too. You know, they thought that the Civil War was going to last for 6 weeks. It lasted from 1861 to 1865. 600,000 people died. To give you some kind of comparison, in the World War II, 257,000 Americans died. In the Civil War, 600,000 died. And think how much smaller the nation was at that time. President Lincoln's secretary took a lot of notes. And this is one thing that's repeated several times. When his secretary would come in to his office and tell the president how many people had just died in battle, the president would routinely grab his head in his hands and he would rock back and forth and say, "I cannot bear it. I cannot bear it." They were people, no different than us. They weren't perfect. They were wounded, no different than us. But they didn't over-identify with their victimization. They didn't over-identify with their woundedness. They didn't over-identify with their limitations. They didn't over-identify with their weakness. They knew that something lay inside them as it lies in us. And through that space within them, they grabbed each other's hands and they did great things. And I believe with all my heart, it's our turn now. And yes, it is in our time as well, no ordinary time. But we will not feel good about ourselves if we miss this moment. You know, sometimes they say that it's so awful and sad, which it is, when a child misses out on their childhood. But I think there's something pathetic when an adult never gets around to being an adult. And it's time now. We need to be adults. We need to be mature. We need to come out of our silos. There are times when, yes, it's significant who's what sex, who's what sexuality, who's what's race, who's what's religion. There are times when that's important. This is not to minimize that, but there are times when we need to remember we need to have a conversation as Americans. And we also need to come out of the silos of our generations. Not everything can be, are you a boomer, are you a millennial, are you a Z? All that has significance, but the truth of the matter is, if you are an adult, whether you are 18 or 80, you are this generation of Americans. And this generation of Americans needs to have a conversation among ourselves, and we need to do great things. And each and every one of us will be guided in our own hearts what that great thing is. However, when it comes to politics, it's our collective assignment. I personally feel that if we had a president who laid it down, this for real and this authentically, and articulated a vision for the country in line with the things of which I'm speaking, I think that would be a very good idea. But if it's not that, that's no reason to let the conversation die. I hope that I'm doing whatever I can. I know that I'm doing whatever I know to do for the conversation to just get started. And I know how the system operates. You get out of here. I went through it for 1 year. Get out, get out, get out, and take your conversation with you. Well, they were able to make me get out, but they can't make me shut up. Speak with me. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.